Steve Reeves, the greatest bodybuilder who ever lived. What if I told you there was a time when a bodybuilder could turn down James Bond because the studio couldn't afford him? When one man's physique was so perfect that artists and mathematicians called it the golden ratio made flesh? Before Arnold, before Lou Ferrigno, before anyone picked up a weight dreaming of Hollywood, there was Steve Reeves. And if you remember Saturday afternoon matinees and those Hercules movies that played at your local theater, you already know his face. But you might not know the story of the small-town Montana boy who became the most perfectly proportioned athlete the world had ever seen, then walked away from it all at the very height of his fame. This is that story. The beginning. Glasgow, Montana. Steve Reeves came into this world in the winter of 1926, in a place called Glasgow, Montana. Now, if you've ever driven through Montana, you know these little railroad towns, quiet as a Sunday morning, where everyone knows everyone and life moves at its own pace. Steve was the only child of Goldie Malone and Lester Reeves, and his start in life was about as all-American as it gets. He was even named the healthiest baby in the county when he was just 6 months old. You can picture those old county fair ribbons, can't you? The kind they'd pin up in the living room with pride. But tragedy struck when Steve was barely 20 months old. His father, Lester, died in a farming accident. One of those heartbreaking stories that was all too common in rural America back then. Goldie found herself a widow with a toddler to raise. And like so many strong women of that era, she packed up what they had and headed west to Oakland, California, looking for a fresh start. Steve would grow up without his father, but as he'd tell interviewers years later, he'd seen pictures of the man. Even at 12 years old, his father reportedly had the kind of shoulders that looked like they'd been carved from oak, standing at the same height and build that Steve would eventually achieve, all without ever touching a barbell. Sometimes genetics really do tell the whole story. Discovering the iron game. By the time Steve reached high school in Oakland, he was already standing 6 feet tall, lanky, and athletic, but nothing special yet. That's when he met Joe Gambino, and this is one of those stories that shows how one chance encounter can change everything. Joe Gambino was maybe 5'5", not a big guy by any measure, but he could beat Steve at arm wrestling every single time. It drove Steve crazy, trying to figure out how this shorter fellow could overpower him so easily. One day, Steve went to Joe's house and asked his sister where he was. She told him Joe was out in the garage, working out with weights. Working out with weights. In the early 1940s, this was still considered pretty unusual, almost exotic. Steve walked out to that garage, watched Joe train, and something clicked. Joe offered to teach. Him charging 50 cents a lesson, Steve took him up on it. Years later, Steve would joke about how that turned out. Joe Gambino became a barber. Steve Reeves became Mr. Universe. Steve started training in his own garage at home, using a barbell set he'd scrounged together, tracking his workouts on the garage wall with crayons. You remember those pre-war years, when you made do with what you had, when ingenuity mattered more than having the fanciest equipment. He'd study magazine pictures of different bodybuilders, not wanting to copy any single one, but taking what he liked from each. John Grimeck's legs, Clancy Ross's definition, Steve Stanko's back. He was building his own ideal in his mind before he built it on his frame. Soon enough, he found his way to a real gym run by a man named Ed Yerrick, who took one look at this tall, broad-shouldered teenager and saw pure potential. Yerrick became Steve's mentor, and under his guidance, something remarkable happened. Steve started training at 16 and a half years old, standing 6 feet tall and weighing 163 pounds. After just 1 month, he'd hardened up considerably. Then, the following month, he put on 10 pounds of solid muscle, hitting 173. The next month, another 10 pounds to 183. Then, 193. In just 3 months, he'd gained 30 pounds of pure muscle without his waist expanding even a centimeter. The other guys at the gym, fellows who'd been training for 3 or 4 years, couldn't believe what they were seeing. As Steve would later explain in interviews, nobody told him it was difficult to gain that much muscle that fast, so it simply wasn't difficult for him. He didn't have any limitations in his mind. It took him a full year to go from 193 to 203 pounds, but by then, he was the best-built guy at the gym, and everyone knew it. The war years. But then, the world had other plans. You remember December 7th, 1941. Everything changed after Pearl Harbor, didn't it? By the time Steve graduated high school, World War II was in full swing, and he was inducted into the Army just like millions of other young American men. He was shipped to the Philippines and fought in the long, brutal Battle of Balit Pass. If you knew anyone who served in the Pacific Theater, you know how savage that fighting was, how the heat and the jungle could break a man as surely as enemy fire. Steve contracted malaria, complicated by a serious case of jungle fever, and it cost him over 20 pounds, most of it muscle he'd worked so hard to build. But here's what tells you about his character. He later said he went through the war as if he was watching a motion picture, keeping that distance in his mind that probably saved his sanity. He saw people killed, saw them carried out on stretchers, but he kept his focus on survival and on what would come after. After the Philippines, he was assigned to Japan and stationed on Hokkaido Island during the Allied occupation. And this is where Steve's determination really shows through. Even in occupied Japan, even after losing all that weight and muscle, he wasn't about to give up on his dream. He wrote himself a little book titled How to Win Mr. America, outlining every exercise he would use, the lifestyle he would live, the path he would follow. With the help of a Japanese interpreter, he tracked down a local foundry and had them manufacture a custom 210-pound barbell set. He built an exercise bench and managed to pass it through Army inspections by claiming it was an ironing board. Can you imagine that? The ingenuity it took, the dedication. He trained so consistently and got into such remarkable condition that his fellow soldiers started calling him the Shape. By the time he came home, after 26 months of service, he was ready to take the bodybuilding world by storm. The competitive years begin. When Steve returned to American soil in 1946, he went straight back to Yarrick's gym, but this time he wasn't anyone's protege. He was a man on a mission. He worked his way up to 215 pounds and decided to make his competitive debut at the AAU Mr. Pacific Coast Contest in Portland. Remember, this was still the era when bodybuilding competitions were small affairs, nothing like the spectacles they'd become later. But even in that environment, Steve stood out immediately. His combination of size, symmetry, shape, and proportion was unlike anything the judges had seen. He won the tall class and the overall title easily, lifting himself from local gym curiosity to competitive bodybuilder in one afternoon. The following year, 1947, he returned to the Mr. Pacific Coast and swept the individual awards for Best Chest, Best Arms, and Best Legs before taking his second overall title. Then he won the Mr. Western America. His friends started pushing him toward the big one, the most coveted title in all of bodybuilding at that time, the AAU Mr. America. Mr. America, 1947. The Mr. America contest had been launched in 1939 by the Amateur Athletic Union, and it represented something different than modern bodybuilding shows. Yes, they wanted the most muscular man, but they also judged sportsmanship, poise, and even personal character. It was meant to find the complete representation of American masculinity. And in 1947, that competition was held in Chicago. Steve made the trip as a relative unknown nationally. He was only 21 years old, and while he dominated the West Coast, the Midwest competitors had never seen him. The field was huge that year, over 40 of the best bodybuilders in the country, the largest group yet to compete in a physique contest. But a few days before the show, rumors started spreading around Chicago. People were reporting that some unknown guy was drawing crowds of followers along the Lake Michigan beachfront just by walking. People couldn't imagine who could attract that kind of attention simply by existing. George Eiferman, who would go on to win Mr. America himself in 1948 and later become Mr. Universe, was there. He later said that when they finally saw Steve Reeves, they knew immediately who would win Mr. America that year. Steve was apparently walking around telling people his name was Mr. X when they asked, keeping his mystique intact. George was so stunned by Steve's physique that he asked him if he had any intestines, because there didn't seem to be any room for them in that tiny waist. The competition came down to Steve and California's Eric Peterson, whom Steve had already beaten at the Pacific Coast show. They were tied at 72 points each, so a pose-down was held to decide the winner. Shining with bronze skin and peak conditioning, moving through his posing routine with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, Steve nosed out Peterson and was crowned Mr. America. According to reports, Peterson was so dejected that he didn't even congratulate the new champion. But Steve didn't seem to care. "I'm the luckiest guy in the world," he told reporters. "Some fellows want to be president, but I've always wanted to be Mr. America. That's what I'm most fitted to be. The perfect physique." Overnight, Steve became the face of American bodybuilding. The top physique photographers in the industry couldn't believe what they were seeing through their lenses. Lou Hannigan, one of the most respected photographers of the era, said that if one of the ancient Greeks came to life and saw Steve Reeves, they'd find it hard to believe he wasn't a reincarnation of those superior beings from Mount Olympus. A writer in Your Physique magazine, which you might remember as the precursor to Flex, proclaimed him the finest specimen of American manhood I have ever seen. What made Steve's physique so special? It was the proportions. The golden ratio made flesh. Standing 6 feet 1 inch tall at 220 pounds, his shoulders were dramatically broad, while that waist stayed incredibly small, creating that taper that looked like classical Greek sculpture. And remember, this was all accomplished without any of the performance-enhancing drugs that would come later. This was just genetics, hard work, and dedication. Hollywood dreams and setbacks. According to the AAU rules at that time, Mr. America winners couldn't compete for the title a second time, so Steve's focus shifted. The problem was, even winning Mr. America didn't mean you could make a living from bodybuilding back then. There were no endorsement deals, no supplement contracts. Steve had to figure out another way, and his thoughts turned to Hollywood. He enrolled in the Theodore Irving School of Acting and started performing on weekends, working theaters and small clubs around Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. Around this time, he caught the attention of Cecil B. DeMille, the legendary Hollywood director. DeMille was such a fan that he commissioned a special poster of Steve for his office at Universal Studios and approached him about starring in his biblical epic Samson and Delilah. There was just one condition. Steve had to lose about 10 pounds so he wouldn't dwarf the rest of the cast. Steve agreed and started dropping weight, but when he'd only lost 12 pounds instead of the full 20 DeMille wanted, the director reportedly told him he wasn't cooperating and canceled the contract. The role went to Victor Mature instead. This would become a recurring problem. Steve's physique, the very thing that made him special in bodybuilding, was actually a barrier in Hollywood. Leading men like Gregory Peck, Gary Cooper, and Burt Lancaster reportedly didn't want him in their films because they didn't want to be shown up on screen. Can you imagine that? Being too impressive for Hollywood? The comeback. Mr. Universe, 1950. In 1950, Steve decided to make one final run at the title that had eluded him. The NABA Mr. Universe had eclipsed Mr. America as the premier bodybuilding title in the world, and Steve wanted it. The problem? He only gave himself 4 weeks to prepare. At 198 pounds, he was well below his competition weight. He headed to the York Barbell Club, the home of John Grimek, where he prepared with the help of his friend, George Eiferman. The transformation that followed became legendary. John Grimek himself wrote about it in Muscular Development magazine. He said visitors to the gym watched Steve train and remarked on how disappointing his physique looked. He'd lost everything except his legs. His arms, shoulders, chest, and back lacked any semblance of his previous muscularity. The general opinion was that he didn't have a chance of even placing, let alone winning. But in the second and third weeks, something remarkable happened. Steve packed on 19 pounds of solid muscle. By the end of 6 weeks, according to some sources, he'd added 35 pounds to his frame. Grimek wrote that by the end of his preparation, everyone in the gym agreed it would take a remarkable man to beat Steve Reeves, if he could be beaten at all. This was muscle memory in action, a man regaining what he'd lost. Triumph in London. Steve traveled to London for the 1950 Mr. Universe as the only American among 50 contestants. His main competitor was England's rising star, 21-year-old Reg Park, who would go on to inspire a young Austrian kid named Arnold Schwarzenegger. The final showdown between Steve and Reg was described as breathtaking. Both men drew deafening applause from the wildly enthusiastic audience. Steve projected classical proportion and heroic muscle shape. The judges admired his lines and his striking stage presence, which they described as matchless. Reg Park brought tremendous size and power, and some observers thought he was actually the better man that day. The judging was incredibly close. 2 judges voted for Steve, 1 for Reg, and 2 couldn't decide, marking them jointly. The final judge cast his vote for Steve, and he won the title. At 24 years old, Steve had reached the absolute pinnacle of bodybuilding, both competitively and aesthetically. And with that victory, he retired from competition forever. Hercules, the breakthrough. With no real money in bodybuilding, Steve's ambitions turned fully toward Hollywood. After a couple years of small roles in films like Jailbait in 1954 and the musical comedy Athena, he married 18-year-old actress Sandra Smith. Unfortunately, their marriage was short-lived. Sandra wanted a settled home life, while Steve was laser-focused on making it in Hollywood. American producers simply didn't know what to do with someone so distractingly handsome and, by pre-steroid standards, colossal. But Europeans had different ideas. After watching Athena, the daughter of Italian director Pietro Francischi begged her father to cast Steve in his upcoming film, Hercules. Francischi cabled Steve a round-trip airline ticket and $10,000. Steve, who had just about decided to quit the movie business for a steady job with a health club chain, decided to take one more chance. In 1957, at 31 years old, Steve traveled to Rome thinking he was making some Italian kids' movie. He filmed it, collected his pay, and returned to America to work at the health clubs. He had no idea what was about to happen. When Hercules was released in 1958, it caught on like wildfire throughout Europe. Fans flocked to theaters to witness this newest motion picture sensation. Then, producer Joseph E. Levine decided to release the film in the United States with an English-dubbed soundtrack, and it became one of the surprise smash hits of 1959. Levine had paid only $110,000 for the distribution rights, then spent 10 times that promoting it. He opened the movie in an unprecedented 627 theaters at once, a strategy that became the Hollywood model from then on. Hercules launched an entire genre of sword and sandal films. Reg Park, Lou Ferrigno, and others would try to replicate Steve's success in their own portrayals of Hercules later on, but none quite captured what Steve had. He was the original, the icon. Critics weren't kind to Steve's acting performance. When interviewers would point out that people said he was gorgeous, but couldn't really act, Steve would respond that it didn't really bother him, because it wasn't something he'd dedicated his life to. When asked if he saw himself as a good actor, he honestly answered no, he never did. But here's what the critics missed. Steve's appearance in Hercules did something more important than demonstrate acting range. Before that film, bodybuilding was seen as a niche subculture, even considered freakish by mainstream society. Steve's classical symmetry and heroic presence made muscular physiques socially acceptable. Many audience members had never seen a body like that outside of comic books or ancient sculptures. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Lou Ferrigno, Frank Zane, and countless other golden era bodybuilders cited Steve Reeves as their inspiration to start training. Arnold said Steve was his idol growing up, that seeing Hercules Unchained, when Steve pulled down the pillars with chains, set a new course for his life. These men, who would go on to become legends themselves, all pointed back to Steve Reeves as the standard, the roles he turned down. After the success of Hercules and its 1959 sequel, Steve appeared in 18 movies between 1954 and 1969. Most of them sword and sandal epics, but some of his most famous moments came from roles he refused to play. When the producers of the first James Bond film, Dr. No, were looking for their lead, Steve Reeves was one of the top names on the list. He was offered $100,000 to play James Bond, but Steve was already the highest-paid actor in Europe, earning $250,000 to play Hercules. He turned it down because the money wasn't enough and he didn't like the billing. The role went to Sean Connery, a former bodybuilder and Mr. Universe participant himself, who accepted just $17,000 for the part. Steve also turned down A Fistful of Dollars, the film that launched Clint Eastwood's career. He said he was a Montana cowboy at heart. All his uncles had big ranches, and he wanted to represent the West the way it should be. He couldn't see how an Italian director making a Western based on a Japanese samurai film could do it justice. The injury and retirement. During the filming of The Last Days of Pompeii, Steve dislocated his shoulder when his chariot slammed into a tree. Being the professional he was, he completed the rest of his scenes and continued performing his own stunts. But the injury kept getting worse throughout the 1960s. It eventually forced him to retire from acting at what should have been the peak of his career. After marrying his girlfriend Aileen, who'd also been his manager, he settled into married life. But he caught the acting bug one more time. Having always wanted to make a Western, he starred in his last film, A Long Ride from Hell, in 1968, at the age of 42, then retired for good. Years later, when asked why he retired so early, Steve said that when he was 32, both Errol Flynn and Tyrone Power had died before reaching 50. He thought about all that stress and realized it wasn't really what he liked to do. The quiet years. Steve spent his early retirement years in anonymity and solitude with Aileen, alternating between residences in Switzerland and California. When bodybuilding promoter Dan Lurie invited him to attend a 1973 contest as a special guest, Steve finally accepted. He appeared on stage in a suit, gave a short speech, and accepted a Hall of Fame-style honor in front of 5,000 people. When the applause finally subsided, Steve said, "I'm sure I don't deserve it, but I want to thank all the fans who have supported me over the years. If I have been an inspiration in any way, then I am happy to have been." Arnold Schwarzenegger later described Steve as shy and introverted, saying his way of expression was through developing his physique. Steve himself told the Los Angeles Times, "I never enjoyed being an actor. What I enjoyed was the challenge, the final years, and legacy." For the remainder of his life, Steve lived on his own terms. He'd invested wisely in stocks, bonds, and real estate during his earning years, which made him financially secure for life. That allowed him to pursue his first love, ranching and breeding Morgan horses on his property near San Diego. "I'm a rancher and a cow-puncher at heart," he said. His shoulder injury kept him from lifting weights, but he remained active, promoting a form of exercise called power walking. He stayed an enthusiastic advocate of drug-free, healthy living. He largely avoided the Hollywood scene, preferring a quiet life among friends and his animals. His wife, Aileen, sadly passed away from a stroke in 1989. Despite maintaining good health for most of his later years, Steve eventually developed lymphoma. Although he'd planned to live to 100, he passed away on May 1st, 2000, at age 74. Steve Reeves was as much of a hero in real life as he was on screen. He was both a champion and a pioneer, the first to successfully bridge the worlds of bodybuilding and Hollywood. He showed the world that the human body could be both powerful and artfully beautiful, a living embodiment of classical perfection. His physique, that perfect golden ratio of broad shoulders tapering to a small waist, is still considered the absolute archetype of the classic male form today. What made Steve different from the bodybuilders who came after him? He promoted bodybuilding as a health-oriented endeavor, at a time when the sport would start moving away from that ideal. With nothing but exceptional genetics, determination, and hard work, he took the timeless dreams of ancient statues and legends and brought them to life. Steve Reeves lived life on his own terms from start to finish. He became Mr. America, Mr. Universe, and a Hollywood superstar, then walked away from it all to live quietly on a ranch with his horses. He turned down James Bond because they couldn't afford him. He refused roles in films that became classics because they didn't align with his values. He retired from both bodybuilding and acting at the peak of his powers because he knew nothing lasts forever, and he wanted to preserve what mattered most: his health, his dignity, and his independence. In an era before steroids, before million-dollar endorsements, before social media made everyone a brand, Steve Reeves proved that perfection was possible through dedication, discipline, and genetic gifts used wisely. He remains, to this day, the greatest bodybuilder who ever lived, not just because of what he achieved, but because of how he achieved it and how he chose to live afterward. So the next time you see one of those sword and sandal movies on television, maybe late at night when you're channel surfing, take a moment to appreciate what you're looking at. That's Steve Reeves up there, the man with the perfect physique, the gentleman who could have been James Bond, the Montana boy who became a god on screen and then chose to be human again. What do you remember about Steve Reeves? Did you see Hercules in theaters when it first came out? Drop your memories in the comments below, and if you enjoyed learning about the greatest bodybuilder of all time, make sure to subscribe.